When Bane awoke, 3 people stood before him. Despite the combination of dangerous and possibly lethal drugs raging through his veins, Bane was able to focus enough to recognize the assassin who had captured him. The second figure was far more interesting, and the cruel glint in her eyes were unbecoming of her otherwise soft features. Her presence drove Bane into an involuntary flashback, and even as the memories of his past flowed through his befuddled mind, he was able to focus on a single one. Through his thoughts, he saw Caleb's hut. The way he'd driven his hand into the boiling water without even changing expression. His steadfast will and ungrudging denial. And among those, his single weakness. The child. The little girl who'd been the Achilles heel to Caleb's iron mind. She now stood before him. Bane tensed as the girl, no longer truly a girl, drove a hypodermic needle into his veins. Spasms of pain racked his body as he lost control of his major motor functions, and his brain went into sensory overload. She waited that way for several minutes, watching his body conform and twist in agony, before pulling out another needle and jabbing it into him. Slowly, the intense pain that had rendered his mind and body immobile subsided, replaced instead by a dull ache that pulsed and permeated his every bone. Bane listened as Caleb's daughter talked, to her accusations of murder, to her grief-filled indictments of anger. He even responded a few times, quoting the maxims of the dark side that he had learned from years past as he rebutted her arguments about the responsibility of power and strength. He knew that, for now, she held this power. He had even told her as such. She held the power to inflict harm to him and in turn make him suffer. But even as he spoke those words, he promised she would pay for her actions. She had driven a sedative into him then, but as his consciousness sank into darkness, it was filled with hate and the glorious power of the dark side. Lucia had watched as the princess had administered the various drugs, pumping them directly into Des' system through the thick artery in his neck. She didn't fully understand the situation at hand, but she knew that Sarah was feeling lost and confused. If Des had really murdered Caleb, then he had brought this onto himself. But when questioned, he had insisted that he wasn't the one who had killed the healer, and Lucia was convinced he was telling the truth. But despite his words, the princess had refused to listen to facts or reason. Her hatred blinded her to everything else. She had stormed off in anger, but Lucia knew it was only a matter of time until she returned to subject Des to another round of torture. She had seen the madness in Sarah's eyes. The princess hungered for revenge. And Lucia knew that look. She had seen it before in the eyes of her fellow soldiers when the enforcers had dragged Des away in cuffs. During the interrogation, she had listened with growing horror to the words coming from the prisoner's mouth. It was clear Des had embraced the teachings of the dark side in ways she could have never imagined. He was not the man she remembered. The camaraderie of the Gloomwalkers meant nothing to the creature he had become. But it still meant something to her. Lucia still believed in the ideals of the Gloomwalkers. They looked out for one another, and they counted on each other to survive. There was honor in their code of unity, symbolized in the secret greeting reserved only for other members of the unit. Closed fist, wrapped firmly on the breastbone, just above the heart. Whatever Des was now, she still owed him her life. He had saved her, the entire unit, too many times to count. Yet when the enforcers had taken him away, she'd been powerless to stop them. Now, fate was giving her another chance to repay her debt. Glancing over her shoulder to make sure nobody in the guard room was watching, she picked up one of the red hypodermics. which seemed to be some kind of stimulant or antidote. She gently pushed the tip of the needle into his thigh. Then placing the needle back into the cart, she turned and quickly left the room. When Bane awoke, his first thoughts were of the strange armor-clad woman whose actions had broken him from his drug-induced stupor. He couldn't remember exactly who she was, probably someone from his past. But that didn't matter now. He was free, and he hungered for revenge. His awareness had spread through the halls of the dungeon, whispering over the minds of all those who walked them. He had sensed Sarah, along with several other powerful individuals. Yet there was one in particular that drew his attention. Xana. She was here to kill him. Her presence sent a fresh ripple of concern through the Dark Lord's mind. He didn't want to face Xana now, not while he was recovering from the toxins Sarah had used to render him helpless, and certainly not without his lightsaber. Bane had made it out of his chamber and into an empty hallway when he heard someone call his name. He stopped short. She called to him again, but not as Bane, the name he'd taken to be reborn into a life of strength and dominance, but as Des, the name of his former life, where he'd been weak and dependent on the compassion of others. He turned, and this time he recognized the being who stood before him as Lucia, one of the junior snipers that had served with him on the Gloomwalkers. He admired her courage, but he wasn't about to let a sense of nostalgia stop him from completing his mission and getting off the planet. 2 times he told her to step aside, but torn between her loyalty to Des and her duty to the Princess of Doan, Lucia remained motionless. Bane began to gather the dark side, the power slowly building. But before he could unleash it, he was hit by a wall of thunderous force rolling out from the corridor to his left. Instinctively, he threw up a defensive shield, absorbing the blow. Despite this, he was slammed against the opposite wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. Lucia was not so fortunate, and as her body ricocheted off the stone walls and floor of the prison, it was reduced to a bloody, misshapen mess. Xana emerged from the tunnel, and picking himself up, Bane readied himself to face his apprentice. "You couldn't bring yourself to kill her," Xana said, her voice filled with contempt. "You've become weak. No wonder you tried to violate the rule of 2. She was standing with her double-bladed lightsaber drawn, the hilt grasped firmly in her hand. Her arm was extended, holding the weapon out in front of her, the twin blades horizontal to the floor. It was a defensive posture, one meant to guard against a sudden attack from an armed opponent. Bane realized Xana didn't know that he hadn't found his lightsaber yet. "I have lived by the principles of the rule of 2 ever since I created it," Bane replied. "Everything I have done has been in accordance with its teachings." Xana shook her head. "I know you went to Prakith. I know you went after Anderu's holocron. I know you were searching for the secret to eternal life. I did that out of necessity. I taught you everything I knew about the dark side. I waited years for you to challenge me, but you were content to toil in my shadow, to remain an apprentice until the ravages of age robbed me of my power. You were unworthy of becoming the master, Xana. That was why I went to Prakith." Bane let his right hand drop to his hip, feigning as if he was preparing to draw his lightsaber. Xana's eyes flickered, drawn by the subtle motion. He kept his hand open, his massive palm completely covering the place where she would normally be able to see the hilt of his lightsaber clipped to his belt. With his mind, he tried to project an image of his hook-handled weapon resting just beneath his empty fingers. Xana stood motionless, staying in her defensive stance, her brow furrowing as she weighed her chances. Then, she threw her head back and laughed as she realized the truth. Bane was without his lightsaber. She lunged forward, and Bane slipped to the side, sending cascades of purple lightning crackling towards her. When she recovered and struck again, he did the same, this time soaring high above her and sending bolts of lightning flying down. As this exchange repeated itself, Xana grew more and more frustrated, unable to down the weaponless opponent that stood before her. But she knew that Bane could not last forever. For all his strength and cunning, her master was not perfect. And it was only a matter of time before he made a fatal mistake. Her hopes were dashed when she heard the telltale alarms of the stone prison begin to blare. Long ago, the prison had been used as a place for political rivals and bothersome enemies of the Doan royal family to quietly disappear. The practice had since been discontinued, but many of the prison's major capabilities were still intact. Chief among them was its self-destruct. Now that the process had begun, Xana and Bane, apprentice and master both, had only moments to escape before the entire prison fell onto them. Swearing, Xana broke off from Bane and ran into a corridor that she knew led to her concealed ship. Bane, on the other hand, broke into a run, trusting in the Force to lead him to the prison's hangar. He arrived just in time to see a shuttle with the Doan royal crest rising up and flying away. For an instant, he thought the princess might be on board. But when he reached out, he felt a very different presence piloting the craft. Someone with a powerful connection to the dark side. Bane couldn't allow his attention to be drawn for long, though. He had a far more pressing problem. From his vantage point atop the balcony, he could clearly see the Ictachi who had led the ambush against him back at the mansion. She was dressed in the same black cloak, and she was standing beside a red and black shuttle. She'd been looking at the escaping vehicle, but as it sped away, she turned to face Bane. Seeing him, an expression of satisfaction flickered across her features. His feet were already moving towards his foe when the Ictachi dropped to one knee and bowed her head, holding her hands palms up as she presented him with his lightsaber. In his studies, Bane had read that the Ictachi possessed a rare form of precognition, where, according to context and chance, their visions could show them glimpses of the future. Both what could be, and for the Ictachi, him or herself, what should. In other words, they could see their own destiny. This particular Ictachi had seen her destiny to be at Bane's side, learning the ways of the Sith. She was powerful, and already attuned to many of the intricacies that lied in the dark side. And less than a minute later, they were aboard the Ictachi shuttle, leaving the stone prison and the final violent throes of its destruction behind them. She had told him her name was the Huntress, and that she'd spent the past 5 years as a freelance assassin. Bane knew more so than anyone of the importance of names. They could define one's identity and drive them to either success or failure. She had told the Huntress then that by choosing a new name, she would be reborn into the ways of the dark side, and that name would serve from now until the day she died as the symbol of her new and greater existence. She had chosen then a single word that reverberated with her own unique power and cunning. Cognis. Darth Cognis of the Sith. The newly anointed Darth Cognis readily accepted the teachings of the Rule of Two, and agreed not to intervene in her new master's final duel with Xana. She understood that for the Sith to thrive, one of them would have to die. Bane's message to his former apprentice had been simple. An invitation. and the challenge. Ambria, the healer's camp. Although her first thought had been that Bane was setting a trap for her, his words at the stone prison and his dedication to the Order eventually convinced her of otherwise. Currently, the Order was fractured. They were no longer master and apprentice, but competing rivals for the mantle of Sith Lord. As long as one of them lived, the Sith would be divided. This had to change. When Xana arrived, she noticed the 2 additional graves dug beside the late healer's hut. Sarah and her bodyguard, she thought. Then she saw Bane, and ignited the twin blades of her lightsaber. Bane likewise drew his own weapon in response, and the 2 combatants began to circle slowly. "I have surpassed you, Bane," Xana warned him. "Now I am the master." "Then prove it." He lunged toward her, and the battle began. Xana expected Bane to begin aggressively, but in no circumstance was she ready for the savage barrage of blows that rained upon her now. He was faster than she could ever have imagined, and he was using new sequences and unfamiliar moves that he had never revealed during their practice sessions. Nevertheless, her defense held, and Bane was forced into a pattern of feints and quick thrusts, probing her otherwise impenetrable defense in search of a weakness. She was being driven back in a slow retreat, and she realized he was herding her towards the shuttles, hoping to pin her against the metal hull with no place to go. Xana was content to play along, taking quick, careful steps backward over the soft, sandy terrain as she began to gather her power. The key was subtlety. She couldn't let Bane sense what she was doing, or he would launch into another wild flurry of attacks, forcing her to focus all her energy on keeping him at bay. She had to give him the illusion that he was controlling the action, when in fact, she was only a few seconds away from unleashing a burst of dark-side sorcery that would rip his mind apart. With her attention split between the enemy in front of her and the Sith spell she was preparing to cast, Xana didn't notice how close she was to the freshly dug graves. Her heel caught, throwing her off balance as she fell awkwardly to the ground. Bane was on her in an instant, and she felt a sharp crack as the toe of his boot caught her in the ribs. But she managed to avoid the next strike and get back onto her feet. Gritting her teeth, Xana reached out and touched the mind of her former master. Bane let out a scream and dropped to his knees. Bane knew the apparitions he saw were a trick. The beasts weren't real. They were just figments of his imagination, born from the repressed memories of his childhood. His greatest fears manifested into physical form. But he'd conquered those fears long ago. He had turned his fear of his abusive father into anger and hate, the tools that had given him the strength to endure and eventually escape his life on Apatros. He knew how to defeat those demons, and he struck back. Unleashing a primal scream, he channeled his terror into pure rage and lashed out with the dark side. It tore through the swarm in a burst of searing violet light, utterly obliterating them. Xana watched as Bane struggled, then overcame the Sith spell she had unleashed upon him. Again, she opened herself to the dark side. This time, however, she didn't attack Bane directly. Instead, she let it flow through her, drawing it from the soil and stone of Ambria itself. She called to power buried for centuries, summoning it up to the surface in wispy tendrils of dark smoke snaking up from the sand. The thin tendrils crawled along the ground, reaching for one another, twining themselves together into writhing tentacles each several meters long. Then, in response to her unspoken command, the tentacles rose up and lashed out at her foe. As the tendrils touched his shoulder, the material of his clothes melted away as if it had been splashed with acid. A chunk of flesh beneath simply dissolved. Bane screamed in agony. Orbalisks had once fused with the skin with a burning chemical compound so intense it had nearly driven him mad. He had also been nearly cooked alive by his own lightning at the Battle of Tython. Sarah had pumped him full of a drug that felt like it was eating him from the inside. But the excruciating pain he felt from a mere touch of the tendrils was unlike anything Bane had ever experienced before. Even still, Bane struck at Xana, and focusing on the spell, she was taken by surprise and knocked to the ground. With his foe unarmed and helpless, Bane raised his lightsaber for the killing strike, only to have it intercepted mid-swing by one of the darkside tendrils. His arm fell, disembodied to the ground, and the Dark Lord collapsed. Bane's vision went black, and he felt the void closing in. In desperation, a last act of defiance, he summoned all his remaining power and invoked the ritual of essence transfer. Bane was suddenly aware of his physical surroundings. He could see through Xana's eyes, he could hear with her ears, he could feel the intense heat of the ritual's crimson glow through her skin. But Xana was still there too. She sensed his assault. He could feel her terror and confusion as if they were his own, and when she screamed in horror, he screamed with her. The black tendrils vanished as her concentration was shattered, disappearing like smoke on the wind. Instinctively, she fought to repel the invader. Bane could feel her pushing him away, rejecting him, trying to drive him away even as he tried to force his way in and snuff out her existence. It became a battle of wills, their two selves locked inside Xana's mind, grappling for possession of her body. They teetered on the precipice of the void, Bane seeking to obliterate all trace of her identity, while she sought to cast him down into the blackness. For a moment, they seemed to be evenly matched, neither gaining nor giving ground. Then suddenly, it was over. From a safe distance, Cognis had watched the two figures wage battle. She was an impartial observer, having no preference as to which one would emerge victorious. She only wanted to serve whoever proved the stronger. She had seen Bane knock the woman to the ground and raise his lightsaber, only to have his arm hewn off by one of the black tendrils. Then, there had been a flash of light so bright, she'd been forced to close her eyes and look away. When she looked back, Bane was gone, and Xana lay still on the ground, dazed but alive. Even from a distance, she had sensed an incredible burst of power, the same power she had sensed in Bane himself. She didn't know how it was possible, but it almost seemed as if the Dark Lord's life energy had burst free of his physical form in one glorious instant, releasing itself upon the material world. Then, as suddenly as she had sensed the presence, it was gone, vanishing like an animal gone to ground. And crazy as it might seem, there was only one place she could imagine it to have gone. As the woman on the ground shifted, Cognis hesitated before asking, "Lord Bane?" "Bane is gone," the woman replied, her voice confident and strong. "I am Darth Xana, Dark Lord of the Sith, and your new master."